Hey guys, just received my orange tree today, and I'll quickly go over what you have to do to get this thing planted either in the ground or into a pot. Now mine came in a pot instead of bare root, and because I'm going to keep it in a pot, I'm going to do a couple things a little bit differently. But let me kind of run down for you in a brief overview what would happen if you got a bare root tree. And then I'll do a more detailed explanation based on it arriving in a pot and going back into a pot or the ground. So let me give you a quick overview. Number one, if it comes as a bare root, you would soak the roots at least 2 to 6 hours. Number two, whether you're going to go ahead and go into the ground or into a pot, you'll take that tree out within a 2 to 6 hour period. Now because I'm going to do a pot, the pot size that I'm going to need at some point is going to be between 16 to 20 inches with at least 4 holes. That's number two. Number three, I'm going to prep my loomy soil because citrus trees like loomy soils. I'm going to use 1/3 vermiculite, 1/3 perlite, and 1/3 peat moss. I'm going to pre-wet the soil with adding sand as optional. I'm going to mix in 1 to 2 cups of citrus fertilizer. And then I will go ahead and once I pot it, I will sprinkle in 1 cup of azomite on top of the soil. I will cover it with mulch and then water it well. Now if you choose not to have a loomy soil with the vermiculite, perlite, and peat moss, you can always use potting soil. Just don't use ground soil or a potting ground soil. And so you want to have either potting soil as the bare minimum, or do the combination of what I told you before, the vermiculite, perlite, and peat moss with the sand optional. Now after you've done the prepping of the soil and you've set up and planted your citrus tree, orange tree, then what you'll have to do is water it well, and then for the first 2 weeks until you see some new growth, you're going to water it every day or every other day at a bare minimum. So every 1 to 2 days you will water this until you see new growth, and after that you can just go on your typical watering method, which is anytime the first 2 to 3 inches of the top soil is dried out, then you can water it. And number five, the satsuma orange tree that I received requires no pruning because it is a dwarf tree. Now what I will do is I will take out broken branches, diseased branches, or dead branches from time to time. But because this is a dwarf satsuma tree, I don't really have to do any pruning. Now that I've kind of given you a brief overview, let me detail you some of the topics that I had already discussed. Number one, the reason why we soak these trees when they come to us 2 to 6 hours if they're coming to us bare root means that there's very little moisture as it traveled to us. And studies have been done that shows that if you soak it 2 to 6 hours, it helps hydrate the plant and gets it kind of fully recovered. Now I've received fruit trees. I've grown probably 2 or 3 fruit trees every year for the last 5 years, and I've taken some where I didn't water them or soak them at all, and some that I soaked 1 hour, and some that I soaked 2 hours, and some I soaked 6 hours. And from my personal experience, I've noticed that if I don't soak it at all, it takes a while. It'll take 3-4 weeks for it to start showing any sort of growth. If I soak it about 2 hours, I notice that I get pretty good growth. And then if I soak it 6 hours, I have about the same successes as if I soaked it 2 hours. So I've kind of come to the realization that not soaking it at all and soaking it only 1 hour is not quite enough. But 2 hours seems to be the right amount of time needed to soak in the roots. Number two, when I discuss the pots, you have to have a minimum of 4 holes. There's been a number of studies done at the universities like Ohio State Universities and others that showed scientifically that having 4 holes is needed to have proper drainage. Now for myself, the booklet that I received pertaining to this tree, since it's already been potted and it's been fertilized and watered before it got here, I actually can leave this in this particular pot for up to 6 months. But I have a really good pot, and I'm going to go ahead and upsize it 1 level. not in a huge pot, but one, I'm going to pot up over time every 2 or 3 years. And since this is a satsuma orange tree and it grows slowly, I'm going to start off with an air pot, just slightly bigger than the pot that it came in. And the reason why I'm going to use a air pot or they call them sometimes grow pots, is it eliminates root bound and root balls, and the air pots naturally prune the roots. And so I'll be able to keep this at a manageable size. This satsuma orange tree can get anywhere from 4 to 6 feet or taller over time, and hit a maturity of about 8 feet. And I really don't want to have a 6 to 8 foot dwarf tree, and so I want to naturally force it to stay small by using the air pot and keep it somewhat manageable. Now, one thing that one of the reasons why I decided to buy the satsuma orange tree, this particular dwarf model, was because it's been grafted, and it also can handle as low as 20 degrees. And it's been made to handle my zone, which is 8B. And so I will use basically a 20-liter air pot eventually for this particular orange tree. I have a pot a little bit smaller that will be kind of the intermediate pot that I'm going to use for this initial replanting. Now, if I was replanting this tree into the ground, you can still do it now because it's only July. But a lot of times if these plants come to us, a lot of citrus and fruit trees will come to us during their dormancy period. But because this was already potted and growing in a horticulture garden, it came to me here in the summertime. Now, it's important to give it every chance you can to have proper root development and establish itself before you either bring it inside or before you plant it. And so what I'm going to do with this particular plant is I'm going to pot it into probably about a 3-gallon bucket first, air pot. Then I'll move up to a 20-liter air pot, which is about 5 gallons. And then within the next 3 to 5 years after the roots have been established, it's not going to get root bound or have any root issues because it's going to be growing in an air pot. Then I will replant it back into the ground. The reason I don't want to plant it into the ground directly right now is because this is such an immature tree. If I plant it into the ground before it's established, it may not survive a cold winter here in 8B. If my winter is mild, it might be able to survive, but I don't want to take that chance. So what I'm going to do is grow this in a pot for the next 3 to 5 years, establish it, then I'll go ahead and transplant it into the ground. And because I live in 8B, a well-established satsuma orange tree can handle the winters. Another thing is the pH level. Citrus trees like a pH level of about 5.5 to 6.5. And the soil mix requirements that I gave you before will give you kind of more of a leaning toward the acidic side of a soil. And so that is something you have to take into consideration. Now the next thing is on number 3, when I was talking about the soil, they like the loamy soil, and so that mix between the 1/3 permaculite, 1/3 perlite, and 1/3 peat moss, along with sand being optional, allows you to have a very well draining soil, because citrus trees do not like to have their roots sitting in water. They don't like to have wet feet. And so it's really important to get off on basically on the right foot, so to speak, by having the right soil mix that will allow you to have fast draining soil. Now, with my air pot, air pots are naturally made to aerate the roots, along with keeping the soil from being retaining water. So I'll be in a good situation with basically the best pot available in order to make this tree successful. And when it comes to vegetable gardening or growing fruit trees, I've noticed that you don't have to necessarily have the most important or best pot for growing vegetables because they only last one season. But when it's something as important as a fruit tree or a citrus tree, you really want to go ahead and spend the extra money and have the proper pot that will make it have a successful future. Now, number 4, mulch. I usually use straw mulch on top as my bedding to keep the soil on top from drying out in the hot summer. But when it comes to citrus trees and orange trees, I like to put a pine mulch on top because it is slightly acidic, and as it degrades and works itself into the mix, it provides a little bit of extra acidity to the soil, which is what I really need. And it allows me one less step that I have to take on an annual basis, which is to add soil acidifier to keep the soil slightly acidic. By adding the pine mulch on top instead of the straw hay mulch that I usually use for like my apple trees, this will allow my plant to stay on the slightly acidic side. What I'll do is I'll make a circle mulch in order to keep at least a 6 to 12 inch base around the root open, and I also buy a base root protector to keep the root from being chewed up by bugs, insects, and deer. Number 5, in-ground watering. Although this tree can survive, down to the 20s, it is really important to buy a tree or shrub jacket within the first couple years that you have this plant. So as you can see, this plant is about 3 or 4 feet tall, and in the wintertime, if we just happen to have a really cold winter here in zone 8B, it actually can either kill or really severely hurt the tree. And so for the first couple of years, I'm going to go ahead, and as we get into the winter months, I'm going to go ahead and buy a shrub jacket just to put over this, just to keep it a little bit extra warm and keep it a little bit safer. Excuse me. Number 6, on the pruning side, like I said, we don't really need to do any pruning for a satsuma tree. Well, what I'll do is I'll prune any dead branches, broken branches, or diseased branches. And I definitely don't want to prune in late winter because as this tree kind of goes dormant and it goes through the dormant cycle, I don't want the pruning to stimulate and try to force it to grow when it's supposed to be hibernating. So my pruning will happen not during late fall or early winter. My pruning will occur in late winter, January, February, March, or early spring. And that's the only thing you have to do with the pruning of a satsuma orange tree. Number 7, I will fertilize, and you have to realize when you're having a fruit tree, you do need to fertilize, whether it's in the ground or in a pot. But specifically in a pot, over the first couple of years, the tree will use up all the nutrients out of a pot. So it's really important that at least a minimum of twice a year, spring and summer, that you fertilize and add some granular fertilizer, slow release fertilizer to this pot. And you also don't want to fertilize in the wintertime or late fall because you want the tree to go into a dormant cycle. And then on the watering side, whether it's in ground or in a pot, you have to water at least a minimum once a week. But like I said before, just test out the soil the first 2 to 3 inches to find out if it's a little bit dry. Then you can go ahead and water deeply and make sure that that you water deeply enough that the water comes out from the bottom. And then number 9, when it comes to spraying, I will go ahead and add a separate video later about what you need to do to spray. But what I'll do is I'll be spraying horticulture oil and dormant spray right in the fall to protect it from the rain and from the cold. And then in late winter and late early spring, I will spray again with horticulture oil and dormant spray for the proper maintenance as we start off the new year. But I'll add another video about all the spraying that you need to do with horticulture oil, insecticide, neem oil, and copper spraying. And so I'll get into that a little bit later. But hopefully this video helped you, and best of luck.